Hello, I'm Anawiltus, and today I would like to talk about my theory on the four modes of governmental change. These are four different approaches that are taking to changing government, to governmental reform, to political change. And I believe that the reason why it's important to make these distinctions, to establish these categories, is because very many times political ideologies tend to get bogged down into the specifics of their values and into the specifics of what their goals are. And I think it's also very important to analyze how they attempt to achieve these goals. And therefore, there are different ways in which certain ideologies might go about doing this. And these ways are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can be approached as combinations or perhaps as singular preferred ways. And in some cases, there are splits within an ideology as to which way is preferred in order to actually affect change. So this is, for me, a very important realist analysis on how these changes actually take place in a society. And I believe that that is fundamentally important to understand the effectiveness of certain ideologies and also to make important distinctions. And for this reason, it is why I decided to make this video. So anyway, there are four of these modes of governmental change, and in theory, they could map onto a tetrahedron, but I will go over my theory here. So the first one is tradition. Now, by tradition, I do not mean the general cultural tradition of the people. What I mean is the governmental tradition. So I would assume that a good example would be common law, or in the case of certain rules in legislative assemblies, that might be an example of tradition. Tradition generally is not something that is guided by a specific purpose, by a specific end, but rather is reactive as the times change, and in that sense, it grows over time, but can also shrink depending on the circumstances. And I would say that this traditional approach is the typical passive approach to governmental change, that as time passes, things naturally change. When people are engaged in common law decisions, very frequently at a small scale, they might not be looking to change the way society works on a cultural level, or to change the way leaders come to power, or to change the way that the government is structured. It is simply based on small decisions rather than large scale goals. And in that sense, it can be considered in some ways conservative. However, in some ways it is not, because tradition is something that changes as time passes, and therefore it can change in ways that are unpredictable and unguided. And that would be the criticism that other adherents of other modes of governmental change might have against tradition, that tradition in many ways does not actually lead to the accomplishment of particular goals, or to the certain cultural norms that are desired, or certain qualities of leadership, or certain structural integrity of governments. And that is why very many people are strongly opposed to the traditional approach of governmental change, as opposed to the other approaches to governmental change, the modes of governmental change. And in that case, tradition, among many political theorists, is very unpopular, although among certain ones it is popular. However, I would say it, generally speaking, it tends to be a clear divide as to whether people are fully in favor of having this type of malleable governmental tradition, or whether people are generally in favor of having something that is more controlled, or more predictable, or more stable. So in that sense, that's where the other modes of governmental change are the more dynamic modes, as opposed to the passive mode of tradition. So one of these is leadership. Leadership as a mode of governmental change focuses primarily on the idea of getting a capable leader, a strong and capable leader who will be able to affect the governmental changes that are necessary toward whichever ideological end, or perhaps just to be a generally capable leader of a country, perhaps to favor the dominance of a particular preferred party, or perhaps to become a sort of uniter of all parties. There's many different approaches to what is considered the desirable leader, but that's not what this is about. This is about examining this. So leadership, in that sense, can be preferred in a large sense by individuals that are in favor of perhaps a dictatorship, perhaps a monarchy, perhaps a dynamic leader of an revolutionary vanguard who then, from an anarchist perspective, becomes the central leader that leads to the destruction of the state, and then steps down from power. So that's one approach to leadership. Another one is a leader that strongly controls the economy and affects changes in that sense. So leadership generally focuses on the leader as the primary method of achieving the goals that the particular ideology prefers. So the other method is the method of culture. So this is a method that requires the changing of the culture, leading to the changing of governmental norms, the changing of traditions, the changing of the types of leaders that, due to their contact with the culture, come to power, changing the type of governmental structure that, due to the culture, becomes viable. So this generally has a focus on a particular culture as being the central organizing element for establishing the viability of government structure, as well as the establishing the usable pool of leaders for a society, and establishing the political traditions that rule in the society as coming from this culture. So the cultural approach in that sense is very much about changing the people as a whole to conform to that particular cultural norm that is desired in order to bring about that cultural dominance that leads to the desired outcomes. So an example of this, for example, for socialists, this might be the idea of class awareness and class solidarity, becoming aware of being a proletarian and then getting together with other proletarians in order to begin the revolution. In that sense, that's one example of this cultural idea. Another example of the cultural idea would be the idea of perhaps ethnic solidarity or racial solidarity in growing that awareness, or the idea of a sort of patriotism as a unifying factor. So generally, the idea is in with the cultural mode of governmental change is to create a culture that has a unifying principle, or is united in some way in order to be compatible with the preferable type of government. So this can include various means, including tribalism, for example. I think largely many identitarian groups tend to prefer this type of change, but in very many cases, it can be very slow, it can be very difficult, and it can meet with a lot of opposition. So the idea that the culture is the dominant aspect in the government can then mean that whatever produces the culture becomes a dominant element within the culture. So this can include the idea of large-scale activism, However, very frequently that's in contrast to what one might call cultural institutions. And this can be the religion in the culture, it can be the education system in the culture, and it can be the mass media. And this is what certain people like to call the cathedral. So, this approach of taking care of the cathedral, of changing the core culture in order to change the government, in order to change the political state, that is the cultural mode of political change. So the fourth mode is the structural mode of political change. So this approach can be seen in, for example, ancient Chinese legalism would be an example that focuses very much on the structure that a government takes in order to achieve certain ends. It can also be seen in constitutionalism, this idea of an organizing law that leads to the separation of powers, which is a very structural idea, the separation of powers. It essentially focuses, instead on making culture as the primary method of change in a political society, instead negating the effects of culture in an attempt to structure the government in order to meet the ideological ends of whatever system is desired. So, structural modes of governmental change focuses very much on governmental models, on creating governmental models that accommodate for various different situations, and therefore focuses very much on flexibility, perhaps on the idea of not having a monoculture, on the idea of trying to find good leaders in a society, how to establish a political structure that leads to good leaders coming to the top and leads to bad leaders being weeded out. So instead of focusing on the idea of a strong leader, it focuses on the idea of the process from which strong leaders come and the process from which good cultures might be produced. So it's very very formal in its core doctrines, very formal in its approach, in that it very much focuses on governmental models and on specific bureaucratic elements. So those are the four modes of governmental change, and I might add some criticisms that these modes might have towards each other. For example, on the leadership mode of governmental change, a criticism would be on the cultural side. The cultural mode might criticize the leadership mode in its reliance on a leader that might not actually have the potential, the strength to change the culture itself. In other words, the leader, having a strong leader doesn't necessarily mean that the culture will follow behind that leader. It doesn't mean, in other words, the idea is that if you plug a strong leader and an effective leader into a bad society, it's not actually going to work. That's the cultural argument. So the structural argument against a strong leader is that the idea of having leaders in that sense, leaders that have a large degree of control on of a society, can lead to long-term instability and potential inconsistency in the quality of leaders. An example that they might pull out is Alexander the Great being a strong and effective leader, but then when he died, even though many of his successors were also strong leaders, because the government didn't actually have an effective structure to keep all these leaders working together, it ended up in a shattering of a very large empire. So that would be a critique that could be made from that perspective. At the same time, a similar critique on Alexander the Great would be made perhaps from the cultural perspective, that the cultural diversity and the incompatibility, the lack of, you could say, medianization that had occurred, or the lack of Hellenization that had occurred by that time in history, led to a sort of disunity in different regions of the empire, leading it to fall apart. So, in that sense, that would be another criticism. So, on the other hand, on the cultural side, the criticism would be from the leadership perspective that even if you have a strong culture, if you don't have the leaders to make it work, it's simply not going to amount to anything. It's not going to have the capability to actually overcome its cultural opponents, its cultural enemies that might wish to destroy it. From a structural perspective, the idea is if you have to rely on your culture being a certain way, then you simply don't have a good enough structure. You simply don't have a structure that is adaptable enough, a structure that is powerful enough to make things work together. That's the structural objection to the cultural position. The structural objection is that the cultural position is simply weak in its formal political models. That would be the structural objection. Now, the objections that there might be to the structural model, to the structural mode from the cultural perspective, would be that regardless of how much you structure the government, different cultures and a disunity will lead to the eventual collapse of the state in that sense. Or from a leadership perspective, the idea is that good leaders might get bogged down in the bureaucracy, and that the bureaucracy might not actually be able and as effective in producing the desired leaders, or that it might weaken the strength that effective leaders that do make it to the top have by unnecessarily dividing the powers in order to prevent the overthrow of the government. So, in that sense, that would be a criticism that those would have for each other. So tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think that there's something more to be added to these models? Do you think that there might be something else necessary to examine? Tell me what you think in the comments section below. Thank you all for watching, and I will be seeing you all next time on Wiltus Over and Out.